He came to celebrate one of the proudest moments of his life, a father watching his son graduate. Dressed in his Marine uniform, he walked into the gymnasium with honor written across his chest. But instead of respect, two guards stepped forward, their eyes cold, their voices sharp. They didn't see his service, his sacrifice, or the years he gave to his country. They saw only the color of his skin. In front of the entire crowd, they ordered him to leave. But what happened next left the room in stunned silence. Who would dare challenge a Marine on his son's day?
Before the noise of the gymnasium, before the sharp words of the guards, his life was one of discipline, sacrifice, and quiet pride. He was a Marine, a man who had given the best years of his life to serve his country. Long deployments overseas, months spent away from family, and countless hours of training had shaped him into someone who understood both strength and sacrifice. His name carried weight in his community, not because he sought recognition, but because of what he represented. To neighbors, he was the man who never failed to stand tall during the national anthem. To his church, he was the quiet helper who stayed after every service, stacking chairs and sweeping floors without complaint. To his son, he was simply Dad, the man who showed up at every soccer practice when he wasn't deployed, who wrote letters from distant bases just to remind his boy how proud he was. Today was supposed to be different. Today wasn't about battlefields or uniforms or even duty to country. Today was about family. His son, his pride, his joy was graduating. After years of watching from the sidelines, missing milestones because of military duty, he had promised himself he wouldn't miss this one, no matter what. He pressed his medals, adjusted his collar, and walked into the school gymnasium with a heart swelling with pride. The gym was filled with laughter, the shuffle of feet, and the smell of fresh flowers carried in by proud families. Rows of chairs lined the floor, banners of school colors hung proudly from the ceiling, and the chatter of excited parents echoed in every corner. He scanned the room for his son, catching a glimpse of the cap and gown, and in that moment, his chest tightened. His boy had made it. As he sat down in the crowded space, he felt the stares. Some were warm, admiring glances at his uniform. Others lingered too long, eyes filled with something else, something colder. But he brushed it off. He had learned long ago that a uniform could command respect, and yet for some, never erase the color of his skin. Still, he focused on the stage, on the rows of students waiting nervously for their names to be called. He imagined his son stepping forward, diploma in hand, and the years of sacrifice fading into a single proud memory. He wasn't there to be noticed. He wasn't there to make a statement. He was there to be a father. Yet under the bright lights and celebratory noise, there was an undercurrent, something unspoken, something heavy in the air. He noticed the way two guards near the back exchanged whispers, their eyes darting toward him more than once. He noticed how their posture stiffened, as if preparing for a confrontation. The Marine, disciplined as always, kept his gaze forward. Years of service had taught him patience and composure. He ignored the shifting tension around him, convincing himself that today, of all days, nothing would stand between him and his son's moment. But tension has a way of building, of sharpening like a knife when least expected. As the ceremony began, applause filled the gym. Names were called, proud families cheered, and students walked the stage with wide smiles. He clapped along, his heart racing with anticipation for the moment when his son's name would echo through the speakers. But just as his boy's row began to stand, the whispers turned into footsteps. The guards were moving closer. This was the calm before the storm. What began as a celebration was about to turn into something else entirely.
The ceremony was meant to be filled with pride, cheers, and the sound of diplomas being handed out. Yet in one corner of the gymnasium, tension thickened with every passing second. The Marine sat tall, his uniform pressed,
his heart pounding, not from nerves, but from the weight of eyes locked onto him. The guards were closing in. Their movements weren't casual, not the wandering glance of security scanning the room. No, this was targeted. Their stares burned with suspicion. Their posture radiated hostility. They weren't just doing their job, they were preparing to confront him. He shifted slightly in his chair, steady but alert, every muscle braced. Years of service had trained him to read situations before they exploded, and this one was about to. The first guard broke away, his boots clicking against the polished gym floor, echoing louder than the applause that rang out for the student on stage. The second followed, their eyes fixed solely on him. Parents in nearby rows began to take notice, whispering to each other, their cheerful faces now shadowed with confusion. The Marine breathed deeply, his gaze steady on the stage. He wasn't going to let anything distract him from this day. He had come to see his son graduate, and he wouldn't allow himself to be pulled into conflict. But the choice wasn't his to make. "Sir, you need to step outside," the first guard demanded, his voice sharp enough to slice through the hum of the crowd. Heads turned, and murmurs spread like wildfire. Why him? Why now? The Marine stayed calm, his eyes lifting to meet the guards. He didn't respond immediately. He knew the power of silence. It spoke louder than words sometimes. But silence wasn't enough for them. "You heard me," the second guard snapped, his tone louder, dripping with authority. "You don't belong here. Step outside." That word, belong, hung heavy in the air. It wasn't about security. It wasn't about safety. It was about exclusion, about stripping dignity in front of hundreds of witnesses. Nearby parents began pulling out phones, holding them high to record. The air shifted. The prideful energy of graduation was slowly drowning in unease. The Marine finally spoke, his voice steady, calm, yet unwavering. "I'm here for my son. I'm not leaving." Gasps echoed through the gym. His son, seated with his classmates in their rows of caps and gowns, froze. He saw everything, the guards looming over his father, the cameras, the whispers, and a wave of fear and shame surged through him, not because of his father, but because of the injustice happening right before everyone's eyes. The first guard scowled and reached down, his hand brushing against the Marine's arm as if ready to drag him out. That simple touch sent a shock through the crowd. Parents rose from their seats, muttering protests. "Why him? He hasn't done anything." The Marine's son leapt up from his chair, his classmates startled by the sudden movement. His voice broke through the rising noise. "That's my dad!" The gym fell momentarily silent. His words cut deeper than the guard's commands. A child pleading not just for his father's dignity, but for basic humanity. The gymnasium, moments before filled with applause and laughter, had fallen into a tense, suffocating silence. All eyes were now fixed on one man, a Marine in full uniform, caught in the grip of an ugly confrontation. His presence, meant to honor his son on one of the proudest days of their lives, had become the center of controversy. The guards loomed over him, their hands firm, their voices sharp, their posture threatening. His calm defiance, his refusal to leave, was like a stone dropped into still water, rippling out into the room until everyone felt the weight of it. Parents shifted in their seats, students whispered anxiously, teachers exchanged uneasy glances on stage. The Marine's son, his cap askew, stood trembling but unyielding in his row. His classmates pulled at his sleeve, urging him to sit back down. But he wouldn't. He couldn't. Not when his father, the man who had missed birthdays, holidays, and milestones to serve his country, was being humiliated in front of everyone.
"Dad!" he shouted again, his voice echoing. "Don't go!" The Marine turned his head just slightly, locking eyes with his son. It was a glance heavy with meaning. "I won't leave you. Not today." But the guards pressed forward, their voices rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "Sir, this is your final warning. Stand up or we will remove you." The air grew electric, charged with fear and anger. Parents pulled out their phones, recording every second. The crowd wasn't just watching a father being told to leave his son's graduation. They were watching an act of racism unfold in broad daylight, in a place meant for joy. The Marine didn't move. He sat anchored, his uniform a reminder of the sacrifices he had made, the battles he had fought, the blood he had seen spilled for freedom. And yet, here he was, denied the simple dignity of watching his child cross a stage. One of the guards tightened his grip, pulling harder. The Marine rose slightly from his chair, not willingly, but under force. The room erupted. Voices clashed, some shouting for the guards to stop, others calling out the injustice. The sound was deafening, a wave of outrage breaking over the scene. And then, the sound of boots. From the far end of the gym, 6 figures appeared. They weren't dressed for ceremony, but there was no mistaking who they were. Navy SEALs. Their stride was sharp, their presence commanding. The moment they entered, the atmosphere shifted again. The murmurs quieted, replaced by a heavy anticipation. The guards froze, their grip still on the Marine's arm, but their confidence faltering. They hadn't expected this. The SEALs walked with purpose, the crowd parting instinctively. They moved like a unit, synchronized, focused, unstoppable. And when they stopped only a few feet away, the silence was so heavy, it felt like the air itself had thickened. One of the SEALs stepped forward, his voice calm yet firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. He didn't shout, but every word carried across the gym. "Let him go." The guards hesitated, their authority suddenly crumbling under the weight of something far greater. They looked from the Marine to the SEALs to the hundreds of eyes watching them. But their grip didn't loosen. The Marine stood straighter now, not resisting, but not submitting either. His face was calm, but his son could see the storm raging behind his eyes. This wasn't just about today. This was about every insult, every injustice, every moment he had endured quietly because of the color of his skin. The SEAL repeated, louder this time, "I said, let him go." And then, slowly, the guard's hands dropped away. The crowd erupted in applause, cheers, claps, shouts of support. The sound rattled the gym, shaking the very banners that hung from the ceiling. Parents stood, waving their hands in solidarity. Students stomped their feet, a chorus of resistance against the ugliness that had tried to stain the day. But the Marine didn't bask in the applause. He didn't smile, didn't raise his fist in victory. He simply turned back to his seat, straightened his uniform, and sat down. His presence was unshaken, his dignity intact. He had not allowed them to take that from him. His son, still standing in his row, wiped tears from his cheeks. He had never seen his father look so strong, not because of medals or uniforms, but because of restraint, patience, and quiet courage. But even in this moment of relief, the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. The crowd knew it, the principal knew it, and every child sitting in that gym learned a lesson they would never forget. Respect is not given to uniforms or titles. It is demanded by humanity itself. As the ceremony resumed, the Marine's son's name was finally called. He walked across the stage with his head high, holding his diploma in one hand, and locking eyes with his father in the crowd. The room erupted again, this time in celebration, but also in defiance of the injustice that had tried to overshadow this day. And when father and son finally embraced afterwards, the applause returned, stronger than before. It wasn't just for a graduate. It wasn't just for a Marine, but for a man who stood tall in the face of humiliation, and for a community that witnessed truth in its rawest form. But as the cheers faded, one question remained heavy in the air.
The ceremony had ended, but the echo of what had transpired lingered long after the last name was called and the tassels had been turned. For the Marine and his son, this day, meant to be remembered as one of pure joy, would forever carry a shadow, not because of what was taken from them, but because of what was revealed to everyone present. When the father and son finally stepped out of the crowded gymnasium, the warm June air felt different. It wasn't freedom they breathed, it was weight. The weight of eyes still watching, of whispers still chasing, of truth that could no longer be ignored. The son clutched his diploma tightly, but his hand trembled. He looked up at his father, searching his face for reassurance. The Marine placed a hand on his boy's shoulder, firm and steady. His uniform may have wrinkled from the scuffle, but his dignity stood tall, unbroken. "Dad," the boy said quietly, "why do they hate us?" That question pierced deeper than any wound the Marine had carried from battle. He had faced enemies on foreign soil, seen friends fall beside him, heard the roar of gunfire echo through desert nights. But nothing compared to this, a son asking why his father, a decorated Marine, wasn't enough to earn respect in his own country. The Marine didn't answer right away. His silence wasn't from ignorance, it was from pain, because the truth was simple, yet unbearable. Hate doesn't care about service, sacrifice, or honor. Hate only sees color. As the father and son finally stepped out of the crowded gymnasium, the warm June air felt different. It wasn't freedom they breathed, it was weight. The weight of eyes still watching, of whispers still chasing, of truth that could no longer be ignored. The son clutched his diploma tightly, but his hand trembled. He looked up at his father, searching his face for reassurance. The Marine placed a hand on his boy's shoulder, firm and steady. His uniform may have wrinkled from the scuffle, but his dignity stood tall, unbroken. "Dad," the boy said quietly, "why do they hate us?" That question pierced deeper than any wound the Marine had carried from battle. He had faced enemies on foreign soil, seen friends fall beside him, heard the roar of gunfire echo through desert nights, but nothing compared to this. A son asking why his father, a decorated Marine, wasn't enough to earn respect in his own country. The Marine didn't answer right away. His silence wasn't from ignorance, it was from pain, because the truth was simple, yet unbearable. Hate doesn't care about service, sacrifice, or honor. Hate only sees color. As they walked across the schoolyard, parents approached them. Some came with apologies, their eyes filled with shame for not speaking sooner. Others came with gratitude, thanking him for showing strength when they themselves had remained silent. And then there were those who kept their distance, their silence louder than words, their discomfort proof that the ugliness wasn't gone, it had only been exposed. But among the voices, one stood out, an older teacher, her hair silver, her voice shaking with emotion, stepped forward. She looked directly at the Marine and said, "You reminded every student in there today that courage isn't just about fighting wars overseas. Sometimes it's about standing still when the world tells you to move." Those words etched themselves in the boy's memory. He would carry them long after the caps and gowns were put away, long after the photos were framed. He had witnessed his father's quiet defiance, his refusal to bow to hate, and it had changed him. The Marine, however,
carried a different weight. He knew this wasn't an isolated incident. He knew it was part of a pattern, a cycle that stretched back generations. His father had faced it, his grandfather before him, and now his son was asking the same questions. How many more? How long until dignity was not a privilege, but a right? That night, as father and son sat at the kitchen table, the diploma resting between them, the silence spoke volumes. The boy broke it first. "I'm proud of you, Dad." The Marine's eyes softened. For all the pain of the day, that one sentence was enough to remind him why he had stood his ground. Not for himself, not even for the audience, but for his son, for the next generation who deserved better. But beyond the walls of that home, the story spread. Videos recorded by parents circulated online. The confrontation was replayed on screens across the nation. Strangers debated in comment sections, some defending, others condemning, many awakening to a reality they had never truly seen. The Marine hadn't asked for attention. He hadn't sought to be a symbol. Yet, unwillingly, he became one. A mirror was held up to society, reflecting a truth that too many preferred to ignore. That racism does not discriminate based on honor, service, or sacrifice. It dehumanizes indiscriminately. The impact rippled. Students who had watched silently that day began speaking out at school board meetings. Parents demanded accountability. Community leaders called for change. The graduation had ended, but the story had only just begun. And yet, for every voice raised in support, there were voices raised in resistance. Some denied racism was at play. Some argued the guards were just doing their jobs. Others dismissed the Marine's pain, telling him to move on. But how does one move on from humiliation? How does one move on from being told in front of hundreds that their presence is unwanted, not because of their actions, but because of the skin they wear every day? The Marine wrestled with that question in the weeks that followed. He knew healing would not come quickly, but he also knew silence was not an option. His son deserved more. His community deserved more. This country, the one he had fought for, deserved better, even if it didn't always deserve him. And so, slowly, he began to speak. At town halls, at schools, at veterans gatherings. His words were never angry, but they carried weight. Racism, he told them, is not just a wound to the body. It is a wound to the soul of a nation. And until we face it, it will keep bleeding into every ceremony, every classroom, every community. His son often sat in the audience, listening, learning. And each time he felt the truth burning brighter. Dignity is not handed down. It is demanded. It is fought for, not with fists, not with rage, but with presence. The resolution of that day was not in the applause, nor in the guards releasing their grip. It was in the lesson that echoed louder than any cheer, that courage is not just about fighting wars overseas. It's about standing against injustice at home. And as the years passed, the boy carried that lesson forward. In college, when he heard friends dismiss racism as exaggeration, he spoke up. In his career, when he saw colleagues treated unfairly, he intervened. And one day, when his own child asked why the world was unfair, he answered with conviction, because too many stay silent, and we cannot afford to be silent anymore. The Marine's act of defiance at that graduation was more than a father standing his ground. It was a spark, a reminder, a challenge. Because in the end, the question is not whether racism exists. We've seen it. We've felt it. We've lived it. The real question, the one that still lingers heavy and urgent, is this: